Hello and welcome. I'm Helen Atkinson, Managing Editor at Supply Chain Brain. I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation today, sponsored by Tive, Inc., the title for which is Curing Product Waste in the Pharma Supply Chain for the Health of the People and the Planet. The healthcare industry is responsible for 4.4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, a number that will more than triple by 2050 if left unchecked. Pharmaceutical brands have increasingly made efforts to reduce their carbon footprints, but one major root cause of excess emissions too often goes untreated: product loss during transportation. Failures in temperature-controlled pharmaceutical logistics that result in product waste are not just counterproductive to sustainability goals. They can incur both drastic financial costs and tragic impacts to patients' health and well-being. In this webinar, our panel of pharmaceutical supply chain experts will unpack the impacts of product waste on the planet, pharmaceutical companies, and patients, as well as offering a solution: real-time shipment visibility technology that allows logistics teams to solve in-transit issues before they result in damage and loss. We're excited to have among today's webinar audience supply chain practitioners from all over the world, and we want to hear from you. After a panel discussion, we'll have an audience Q&A session. Please submit questions using the tab at the bottom of your screen. We will not be using people's titles or company names, so go ahead and ask anything you like. And please do post your questions at any time during this webinar. We'll try to answer as many as we can. Thank you. All right, I'm going to introduce our speakers now. First off, we have Richie Daigle, who is Enterprise Account Executive at Tive, Inc. Richie has extensive experience in the transportation and supply chain data visibility space, from podcast host to blog writer to all-around industry resource. Prior to Tive, Richie was the Sonar Enterprise Account Executive at FreightWaves. In his younger days, he was a pitcher in the San Diego Padres system. The skills he learned playing ball, including character traits such as honesty, integrity, loyalty, perseverance, self-control, and personal initiative, continue to drive Richie to this day. Welcome, Richie. We also have with us Chris Wallace, who's a consultant in supply chain operations. Chris is an international supply chain leader with a proven record of building and developing supply chains across the pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device industries. Currently an industry consultant, Chris previously led the setup and operation of the supply chain function at Clover Biopharmaceuticals as Senior Vice President of Supply Chain. Right, I'm going to hand over to Richie for a brief introduction to this topic. Richie.
Yeah, thanks so much, Helen. Excited to be part of this conversation. I think a good place for us to start is just to understand what happens when a pharma shipment can't be delivered. And of course, a lot of this depends on the type of pharma shipment. Pharma shipment's a huge umbrella, but broadly speaking, when something goes wrong and a shipment doesn't arrive on time or in full, what's next? You're going to have the loss of that product and everything that went into that product. So you have wasted products that have to be, safely reconciled. Replacements have to be put in, get to the end destination. So what that may, include expedited shipping of some sort to try to get whatever that product is to its final destination, especially if it's time sensitive. And then, your patients are left in the lurch until something arrives. And that's probably the most problematic, thing that can occur. So there's all different types of things to consider here, from the loss of finances, like in some instances, insurance may only cover, one time, one product. So if something goes wrong, you're out of pocket for whatever that may be, if insurance isn't going to be able to cover that. So there's a financial hit, not to mention what could be coming, having to pay separately for the replacement to be shipped out. And then you're going to have this sustainability hit where you have to, go through your carbon footprint of making that shipment all over again. And now with more and more data available for companies to leverage to measure, how much carbon is being put out per truckload movement or per air cargo movement, or even in the ocean, as that's becoming more measurable, you're able to kind of start calculating to what degree are you impacting the environment by having to ship out replacements. So you have this financial burden, or the implications, you have the sustainability implications for when things go wrong, not even getting into everything that goes into a carbon footprint for the replacement, to manufacture replacement therapy. And then you have, probably the most important is patients that are potentially left without the medications that they need to get by. And in some instances, that can be a really dire circumstance. In the best cases, it's an annoyance, but it's still a problem no matter what. So I think we can kind of look at, the scope of everything that happens just from one shipment that doesn't arrive on time and in full. And if we zoom out and we start looking at how frequently is this happening, to what degree is this sort of thing taking place, we see that it's more often than we think would be ideal, right? And I think before we kind of jump into like all the problems that exist in this situation, it's good to understand that during the pandemic on the whole, the pharmaceutical industry really stepped up to meet some demands in a situation that really hasn't happened before, right? And so there's a lot of good things that came out. Like people performed really well, and pharmaceutical companies, supply chain companies kind of met those challenges head on. But at the same time, those challenges exposed a lot of room for improvement, and it kind of makes me go back to baseball years. I got to spend some time with Greg Maddux in spring training. And one thing that he told me that kind of stuck with me, and Maddux is one of the all-time best pitchers, he'll go down as one of the greats. And he said he only gets worried when he can't identify the problems in his mechanics. And as long as he knows where his issues are, he knows what he needs to work on and he can stay focused. But it's when he doesn't understand or when he doesn't know when something's off, that's when he starts to freak out or when he starts to get really uneasy. I think the same sort of thing exists within pharmaceutical company supply chains, and that's what was exposed during the pandemic. So you had this kind of paradox of meeting this incredible challenge head on, while also having that incredible challenge expose all of these opportunities to improve. And I think that exposure is a positive, because without that, we wouldn't know, right? We would, be flying blind, so to speak. So moving along, when we start looking at, I think Helen mentioned this, is, healthcare is responsible for 4.4% of global net greenhouse gas emissions, and that number is expected to go up. And, when we continue to kind of zoom out and we look at up to 25% of vaccines that are being shipped incorrectly or reaching the destination damaged, that number is actually above the number of temperature sensitive products that are damaged during shipments due to temperature excursion. So like that 25%, it's only 20% of temp sensitive products on the whole that are damaged. So there's something going on. Like if there's any temperature sensitive freight that should be arriving on time and in full, one would think that would likely be pharmaceuticals. So I think this highlights that there's a lot of opportunity here for improvement, but we need to know what needs to be improved, where, how, and how we can go about that. So excited to jump into this conversation, but yeah, just wanted to highlight or spend the first part here just talking through kind of the scope and the magnitude of the problem, and the not necessarily the problem, but the opportunity here, and how, if we can meet this opportunity, we're looking at 35 billion in products associated with losses annually. So just on the dollar figure amount is, pretty substantial opportunity here, but that's not even getting into the sustainability and what can be done in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, and the ability to get these really important shipments to their end destinations, which are patients who need these therapies. So I'd like to think that technology may be able to meet all of these, and that by leveraging technology, that the whole industry may be able to meet these together. So yeah, that's I think the one thing to leave on this initial part is that what people have been doing has worked in regards to making sure that bad pharmaceuticals don't reach patients. I think if that is the only goal, is to make sure that a vaccine or a therapy that's gone bad in transportation doesn't reach a patient, yes, that is working. But I don't think that's enough. I think that we can go further, and I think that we can do more. And just sweeping the rest under the carpet and throwing money at it doesn't seem like a viable option anymore when we're considering sustainability, especially. So excited to see what the future holds and how we can all work together to do better. Yeah.
And now we're going to get Chris's introduction to this thing. Chris, let me start by asking you this. Do you think that the pharmaceutical industry became more aware of the impacts of a lost pharmaceutical shipment in terms of carbon emissions and sustainability during the pandemic? Was there a wake-up call there? And what are the impacts that you've seen in your broader experience across the pharmaceutical industry?
I think it was a process that was happening anyway, Helen, but clearly the pandemic gave a greater impetus and focus to the issue. I think one of the very telling stats from the World Health Organization was as the second wave of lockdowns were upon us and the pandemic was supposedly back in full swing, but vaccinations were obviously moving ahead of pace, that despite the hundreds of millions of people that were being vaccinated, that they were basically having to throw away 30% in some cases of those vaccines, which, apart from being incredible waste, led to shortages in certain countries and lots of other issues associated with that, which clearly is something that we would never want to see a repeat of. And I think what it highlighted was that away from the pandemic and the vaccination program, there were still products being shipped all around the world, and we had perhaps not as bad, but similar failure rates, which, as Richie pointed out, is an incredible cost, as well as, I believe, an indictment on our industry. I know that some stats from, for example, McKinsey showed that just to expedite a delivery costs between 3.5 and 5 times as much as the original. And that, again, is a huge cost for us as supply chain professionals.
Right. And of course, the expedited shipments are always both more expensive and because they tend to be by plane rather than ship or train or whatever, they have more of an impact on the environment. Chris, what about the impact on companies' bottom lines? What have you seen there? It sounds like this is really expensive stuff, this waste.
It is, but traditionally, and I know there's a number of different participants on this webinar, but we've all seen that pharmaceutical life science tends to be a high margin industry. In my supply chain career, I've been told on a number of occasions as a young manager, but also later on as a seasoned professional, that the objective was just ship it and almost damn the consequences, because the product was urgent and it was required by the patient. Clearly, we are there to serve the patients above all else, but therefore the actual logistics execution was clearly very inefficient. And the industry's been able to wear that. something that I doubt would be tolerated in many other industries. And you've seen the stats on wastage and so on. I would think other industries looking in from the outside would see that as quite dreadful. And it's up to us as an industry to improve. And I think there's plenty of scope for us to do so. Yes, there are many challenges within our supply chains. They're very complex. The products can be incredibly sensitive, fragile. Exposure to other factors like humidity can damage them, as well as temperature excursions. So we recognize it's complex, but I think there's a real task for us collectively to step up to the plate and improve it.
Right. So, obviously this is a problem, and I think that a lot of people in the sort of public eye would imagine that pharmaceutical companies are held to a higher standard than, say, Amazon sending out, headphones or whatever. But and obviously it'd be interesting to compare those experiences. But let's just focus for a moment, Chris, on patients. I mean, so you said that there were actually outages of vaccines, for example. Do you think there were actual lives lost, or people getting sick, or getting poor healthcare as a result of this?
The evidence is there that the vaccination programs were delayed in many cases because of problems with supply. And those problems were not just shortages of product, it was of the challenges in getting the product to the market.
Right.
I don't think that there were clearly vaccination delays without question. I think that, but if we look away from that at other treatments and therapies for patients, they're absolutely patient and mission critical. They're life critical. Therefore, any problems with those shipments can be literally fatal if we're not careful. So, without being overly dramatic, we need to be really careful in terms of what we achieve, and there are barriers to achieving 100%. We all recognize that, but we want to try and get there as close as possible.
Of course. Well, thank you, Chris. I mean, Richie, I want to move on. What operational failures typically do result in a lost or a delayed pharmaceutical shipment?
Yes, I think there's a lot of things that can cause something to be lost, damaged, delayed, not arrive on time and in full. I mean, the most obvious is a temperature excursion. For certain therapies, certain types of shipments need to remain in a certain temperature range. Some of those temperatures can be quite low, for cryogenic and dry ice shipments for different types of therapies. Other shipments will be in a more normal range, but still a very governed and important range of temperatures. And when those shipments fall out of that temperature range for a certain period of time, they're no longer, you can't give those, you can't administer those therapies or those drugs at that point, and they have to be thrown away. So I think temperature is probably the big factor. What plays into temperatures as well is going to be any sort of delay. So if something is held up, let's say it's supposed to move from point A to point B in 6 days' time, but there's some sort of holdup where that turns into 2 weeks or 3 weeks or longer, then the patient is without that medication in the time that they need it. So they maybe you're missing that window for when they need to take that therapy. And then also you're extending the period of time where you have risk for it falling out of temperature. And maybe the packaging wasn't built to last that long or to keep it in temp for that long. Or there's any number of factors that can occur there. Other things, for certain types of LTL shipments where you just have a single pallet that's being moved around, you have risk of that pallet being dropped by a forklift while it's being moved out of, let's say, a container into an LTL truck, or any time freight's being moved from one, container to another or anything like that. There's the risk of damages, physical damages from impact. Of course, if you impact something and there's break or damages to the shippers or the what's being used to hold that freight, that's a problem as well. That could impact temperature, that could impact, it could be leakage, or there's any number of things that can happen where now that cargo needs to be thrown away as well. So I think you look at temperature, delays, impact, and then the last thing would be theft. There's a lot of therapies and drugs that are shipped that are hot commodities on the streets and in the black market. And, nefarious players are always scheming to try to identify where, opportunities to steal things while they're in transit. And there's certainly an opportunity there. So protecting against theft and making sure that especially certain types of medications are really being watched closely. That's so meaningful, because if they do get out on the streets, then one, the patients that are supposed to get those therapies that need them don't get them. And then people that shouldn't have those drugs or shouldn't have access to them do have them. And so you kind of have this dual problem from theft and security that can exist. That's a much bigger topic, and probably that alone is worth its own webinar in and of itself. But
sounds like it. Yes, indeed.
I think those are just some of the obvious ones. I think there's more as you kind of peel back layers of the onion, but the things that come immediately to mind as some of the primary problems are going to be, temp, delays, impact from dropping, and then theft and security.
Wow. And do those last three reasons explain why? I think you said earlier that the non-cryogenic or temperature-controlled pharmaceuticals were experiencing it was a 25% wastage rather than 20% in the temperature-controlled ones. So it sounds like those other factors other than temperature excursion are really very important.
For sure. And I think that pharmaceuticals, and rightly so, are probably looked at more closely than a lot of other types of freight. This is a speculation that I would have. I don't have anything to back it up, unfortunately, but I would like to think that people are looking at pharmaceutical freight with a closer microscope than a lot of other things that may be, like a shipment of ice or something like that.
So you're talking about customs delays, etc.
Yeah. And this, so I think that's something to keep in mind, but yeah, I think it does highlight the importance of not just having technology that shows when you should or shouldn't administer something to a patient, but there's the technology today to go further to start mitigating some of these risks that exist while something's being, while something's in transit. So I think that's the big shift, is not just let's do what's necessary to know when something went bad, but let's start trying to be proactive and as much as we can.
Right, and preventative, right. So let's dig into that. And Chris, I wonder if you would be able to dig into a little bit about what most pharmaceutical companies are doing today to reduce product loss. What sort of strategies are they able to employ?
In fact, Richie's mentioned one, and that is temperature monitoring was always a case of putting the log with the goods then shipped. And
Chris, I'm sorry, I'm gonna stop you there. I think we've got a technical problem with your audio. Maybe Richie, maybe you could jump in here. So what are the strategies that pharmaceutical companies are employing to reduce product loss?
Yeah, I think like current state, there's passive temperature loggers that are being used as the standard, right? And I think, Chris would kind of speak to this as well, as, this is the standard right now, is I can pull this device off of something and download information after the fact to see, was this in temperature while it was in transit or was it not? So this is a way, and I think this is great at making sure that patients don't get a treatment that was out of temp that's not going to work. That's the big thing. You don't want to have someone take in medication thinking that it's going to do one thing and it doesn't do anything, or it could be bad or poisonous, since it was whatever whatever the other consequence would be, like that's really important to make sure that patients get therapies and drugs that work. And having a passive device is a great way to do that. But I think that's the base.
Can you explain exactly what we mean by a passive device, just so that we make sure the audience is clear?
So a passive device is going to be something that records temperature, but you can't get that information until you download it off of the actual device. So you have placed this device in with a shipment. It's going to be monitoring and recording. And then after the shipment arrives, somebody needs to plug that device into a USB and download that information to see, okay, this was in temp, it wasn't, like, or maybe there could be a visual marker on there that someone looking at it after the fact, after it's arrived, this is good, this is bad. But this is a reactive way, right? This is passive.
It's not constantly pinging with real-time information. It's just gathering the information until it gets downloaded. That's still very useful. And I mean, of course, as they say, hindsight is 20/20, but then it gives you all this useful data that you can perhaps use to identify patterns, like coming through a particular port with delays. This is where the temperature fell above a certain acceptable range or whatever. Is that right?
Maybe, if the device is also logging location, but a lot of these passive devices are only going to be logging temperature, and that's all it's there for. And the way they're being used today is, this is good, we can take it. This is bad, it goes in the trash. Like that's the only
so
way.
It's really a yes or no kind of thing. It doesn't give you much more useful data than that, right?
It didn't. And the thing is now with real-time devices that are out on the market, if you have that information in real time, you have the opportunity to save some of these shipments before they go bad. So if you can, for example, we had a customer who had a pallet of pharmaceuticals on an airplane on the tarmac, and human error, somebody set the refrigerator unit to the wrong setting. Well, an alert went off from this real-time device that said, this freight is out of temperature. And because somebody received that alert, they stopped an airplane on the tarmac, ran out there and said, something is crucial, is direly wrong. Like there's a big problem. Found the human error. It was an innocent error. No one did this on purpose. It was just something that happens. But we were able to fix it. And now $1 million pallet of pharmaceuticals stays in temperature before it takes off for a 6-hour flight, where it just would have all went in the trash upon, landing on the ground at its destination. So like having that information in real time just allows for opportunities to be more proactive and save something. Now, the benefits of that are not just that the freight gets there on time, but now the sustainability. You don't have to refly that pallet of pharmaceuticals. You don't have to reaccount for manufacturing the pharmaceuticals for that pallet, the patients receiving their therapies and drugs in a more timely manner. So there's all these benefits from just saving one shipment. It kind of trickles down. So that's the movement, is instead of just only ensuring that patients don't receive bad pharmaceuticals or bad drugs, but let's see if we can do that. Let's keep that baseline. Let's not remove that, but let's add to it the ability to save shipments, while they're in transit as well.
Right. Super. And that's a great story about running out onto the tarmac to stop the plane. Gives such a clear illustration of the difference between these passive sensors and ones that are able to offer real-time information. That's fascinating. Thank you, Richie. Chris, are you back with us?
Yes, I am. The key thing, I think, and Richie touched on it, is the ability to take remedial action. And in any complex supply chain, that's absolutely critical. Shipments typically go through something like 15 to 30, depending upon what it is, where it's going, pieces of handling. That's a lot of opportunity for damage, problems, anything else. And if obviously you have that real-time data, that can enable you to identify the problem, and also, even if it's through a third party, put it right.
Right, that's very important. Yes, because of course, like any other supply chain, this is dispersed between multiple external partners, and so there's a need to sort of close the information loop there. I would imagine. So, what does the future look like? Well, what should pharmaceutical companies be doing next? What's next in the evolution of pharmaceutical shipment monitoring, Richie?
Yeah, so I think there's a roadmap of, as real-time sensors like Tive are deployed, there's tactical and strategic applications for that technology. The tactical applications being that you can maintain everything that you have in place for passive temperature logging, but you can add to that with real-time temperature, also real-time humidity, real-time light sensors with knowing when doors are opening for security measures, real-time shock alerts if something's dropped, and you have that location being added to it all throughout any mode of transportation anywhere in the world. So when you have all that information in real time, the tactical applications are that you can save shipments. You can identify theft when it's happening in the moment. You can identify temperature excursions as they're happening in the moment and be more proactive to get out in front of those things. From the strategic standpoint, and I think this is where the market is going to be going, is as you start aggregating all of that tracker data, let's say you put 100,000 trackers in all your shipments for a year, and at the end of the year you have all this rich data. When you start talking about AI and big data, when you aggregate all of the tracker data across all your shipments, and you can start looking at which carriers in your network are having the most temperature excursions, right, which lanes in your network have the most light alerts and have the most security risk. Maybe there's multiple lanes that you're utilizing between a specific origin destination pair, and you want to find the one that's the most efficient and timely, that also carries the least risk. So when you start thinking about network optimization, that goes a big way in terms of reducing cost, building efficiencies, minimizing greenhouse gases, and maximizing kind of your sustainability efforts, and getting more of these therapies to their final destinations on a more proactive and consistent basis. So you have the kind of the initial tactical, like, let's be able to be aware of what's happening with our freight while it's being moved. And then also the strategic, where we can utilize this data on the back end to better set up our supply chains and optimize our networks to be even better going forward.
Right. So, I mean, this is about some very fundamental issues with just designing a supply chain or altering a supply chain. So it sounds like what this empowers pharmaceutical supply chain managers to do is say, okay, look, we're sending stuff through Rotterdam and it's habitually getting delayed because of whatever. Maybe we should be switching to another port if we can get the right services, on going to the distribution center from there. I mean, is it really at that sort of fundamental level that supports those kind of decisions?
Exactly. And there's even a story where there was a specific lane and freight was showing up, 10% of the truckload was always damaged, and the company couldn't figure out why, and they're yelling at their carrier, why is our freight always damaged? And the carrier's like, I don't know, we've loaded on the truck, we drive it, like we're really, but there's this problem. We put a device on there and we found that it was a really, really bumpy road, and like those bumps on the trucks
right,
were consistent with damages. And so just rerouting that truck on a different way, maybe it's 20 minutes longer, but it's a smoother path. And now, voila, magic. Everything is on time and in full, and the damages have gone. So you don't know what you don't know. And what the aggregated data does from these trackers is boils all that up to the surface so that you can see where risk lives within a supply chain and start making those data-driven decisions around what port to use, what lane to use, what carriers to use. It's just more information that you have at your disposal for some of those decisions. And those decisions can carry big effects if you're going to be sending 50,000 loads on this specific lane or between these ports or whatever it may be. So I think the strategic application is really exciting. And the tactical application for saving shipments and transit is super exciting as well, and very valid as well.
That's fantastic. It's such a high tech meets low tech scenario where you've got like a bad road, but real-time sensors sensing it. That's fantastic. Chris, what do you think is the next step in the evolution of pharmaceutical shipment monitoring?
Well, I think Richie highlighted a few there, and I might add to that, I've literally changed lanes and airlines because of the data that we got back. But I think also the advent of the cloud has been a huge benefit to particularly some of the emerging markets and accessing that data. Previously, we would always have the issue of data delays and things like that. The accessibility of the cloud is certainly something that I think is quite exciting. I'm very conscious that we in the developed world have got lots of things that we can do to monitoring our supply chains, but perhaps we overlook the fact that there are parts of the world where that infrastructure isn't as good and there's higher risks, all the things that Richie's mentioned, but also I think this data accessibility is going to be very advantageous to us in the future as well.
Right, because once data's in the cloud, all you need is a rudimentary connection to the web, and you can start to access it from anywhere. Correct.
Correct.
Wonderful. So we've talked a little bit about how real-time shipment visibility reduces product loss, but I wanted to dig a little bit into this whole idea of managing risk, and I'd like both of you to talk about this before we move on to the Q&A session from the audience. It seems that there's been more and more talk about managing risk, that resiliency, which is the latest buzz term in post-pandemic in supply chain management, is really about, or very largely about risk management. Richie, can you talk a little bit about how real-time tracking technology really helps you focus on that?
Yeah, I think this gets back to kind of the tactical risk management and the strategic risk management, and kind of bucketing risk into the tactical and the strategic. From the tactical, being aware of your shipment's location and conditions at any point in time is inherently going to make you aware of risk as they come up. So as a temperature excursion happens, the moment doors are open when they're not supposed to be, when there's an impact of some sort, if you know and you're aware of these events when they occur, then you're more empowered and equipped to do something about them in the moment, potentially saving the shipment. And if you're not able to save the shipment, you can at least start the process of getting a replacement out the door where you may not have to have it expedited because you're able to act so quickly. So there's a lot of ways to kind of mitigate risk just by increasing your overall awareness of where shipments are located and what condition they're in. And on the strategic standpoint, on the strategic application, if you know that you're going to have a lane where you have $1 million in a truckload, and you're able to look back over the aggregated tracker data from last year, and you see that this one carrier never had a temperature excursion, their on-time performance was really, really good. This is the carrier that you want to utilize for those really high value and sensitive, moves. And the opposite of that is also the case, where if there are carriers in your network that didn't meet, certain, standards, maybe it's time to go back to market during an RFP, cycle, and either award more freight to the good carriers and kind of take away from those that aren't performing. But at least you have the data to understand where that's happening, and that is removing risk as well. And even then on a geography or on a lane by lane basis, if you identify the lanes within your network where you're seeing security issues, or light alerts or temperature excursions, then you're better equipped to say, okay, we need to focus on what's going on this lane, what's happening. Is it a carrier issue? Is it a geography issue? What can we do to mitigate and remove risk that we're seeing there? So a lot that can be done just with more data, but you need that data to be trustworthy, real time for the tactical, and comprehensive and trustworthy for the strategic.
Great. And it could just be a bumpy road, right?
Exactly.
Chris, would you like to talk a little bit about risk management? What are you seeing out there in the industry as a consultant?
I think to Richie's point, the advent of the data allowed some proper analysis. I think it's true to say, as an industry in the old days, we would tend to review our supply chain network and arrangements on a fairly regular basis, no problem with that. But in the detail of the data availability now allows us to do that on a constant basis. So to take Richie's example, if there is a problem with a particular lane, you can jump on that and solve it and have an alternative in place very, very quickly. You also have the essentials of any supply chain network can change all the time. You can have different suppliers, you can have different distributors, you can have different customers. So it is an iterative process. The advent of this data pool that is constant and in real time enables you to do that analysis. And without that analysis, your decision making is likely to be flawed. With that quality of data and quality of analysis from that data, you can make informed and better decisions.
Right. Oh, well, this is all absolutely fascinating, and I'd like to open it up to our audience to get some questions. Thanks so much to Richie and Chris. Again, I'd like to remind you in the audience that you can submit questions using the tab at the bottom of your screen, and we will not be using people's titles or company names. So go ahead and ask whatever you would like. Actually, we have some questions that have already come in. This one from Peter, temperature control impact. He's looking at the temperature control impact on sustainability for air versus sea. Can you talk about the impact for air shipment using dry ice, phase changing material, or active refrigeration? Wants to know what the impact of the CO2 footprint is on dry ice as opposed to other options. What is the factor on CO2 for ocean reefer shipments versus air? I think that's basically, thank you for that question, Peter. Richie, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I think we're seeing companies that are analyzing, for international air versus ocean, and then domestic, you see some of these same conversations between intermodal and truckload. You can get more containers and more freight on an ocean vessel, same thing on a train. So your CO2 footprint is going to be a bit, is less than what it would be if it was going air or truckload over land. So now what we're seeing is the ability for companies to measure that. And without being able to measure that, you may be doing something that is sustainable, but if you can't prove it, then you're not going to get the credit for it, right? So a lot of sustainability efforts now are all about measurability. I think, if I'm reading Peter's question here, there's a lot that's going into, when you're looking at dry ice versus just standard cooling, if you will, we'll call it that, versus ocean versus air. All the ingredients are now there to make those calculations. I don't know the calculations off the top of my head, but all the information is there for those decisions to be made and for the sustainability factor to be captured. How much carbon are we saving by choosing X, Y, Z? So I think companies do have that ability today.
Okay, thank you. I have another interesting question here, asking about one-way disposable tracking devices, which obviously have ESG implications because you use them and throw them away. Is that the only option, to use disposable tracking devices, or are they recycled?
Yeah, so Tive devices can be recharged and reused. And so we have a number of clients that they have a micro USB port on the side, and we have clients that keep the same units in rotation. We also have a green program where, any tractor we receive back, there's credit for that. We want to get as many of these back as possible. We do have some clients that are only able to use them in a one-way sense or, disposably. And we're trying to minimize that as much as possible. But, especially in the pharma space, even in that instance, the implications for a device versus a whole pallet or truckload or shipment of food,
of course,
seems to be, necessary. So Certainly doing as much as we can. And also our device is non-lithium. And so not having lithium, our pharmaceutical device, there's no lithium in there. The battery is a normal battery. So there's more applications, there's more airline approvals. Tive's going to be approved on over 130 different airlines. And then there's environmental, things to consider or considerations as well when you're removing lithium from the equation.
Right. Well, actually, that brings us on to another question. Thank you for raising that, because air obviously has its own restrictions, and particularly with lithium batteries exploding. What tracking methods are you using for temperature monitoring, etc., while cargo is in the air? Are you able to keep it real time? Are there wireless sensors, or what's going on?
So the trackers, the Tive trackers, are going to record no matter where they are. If it's in the ocean, if it's in the air, if it's on a truckload, it's always going to be recording what's happening. However, there's no cell service in the air, and there's no cell service in the middle of the Pacific at the moment. So when shipments are in the air or on a vessel in the ocean, we have ways of either tracking the plane for location or tracking the vessel for location. And then once those shipments arrive, either on the ground for air or at port for ocean, and regain cell connectivity, all of that data that was recorded while it was in the air or while it was at sea immediately goes into the cloud. So while the container is still on the vessel, or while the freight is still inside the plane, you're going to have everything that happened while it was in the air or while it was at sea visible right in front of you on your computer screen before the freight's even unloaded. So anything, again, that gives you that first mover's advantage to get in front of anything that may have occurred and start, either verify everything's good, or if anything needs to happen, you can start working on it immediately.
Right, super. That's a great answer. Thank you, Richie. Chris, I've got an audience question here that I think might be one for you, because it's more of an industry-wide thing. We have Calvin interested in the increasing logistics costs due to the ESG mindset, or increasing concerns about ESG issues. Do you think, and he says it seems that more companies are preoccupied with cold chain, even applying cold chain for room temperature goods. So do you think that overall there's going to be an increase in logistics costs because of ESG considerations?
I don't see why there should be. Personally, I've worked for companies that have been temperature monitoring everything, every shipment, and that included ambient. And indeed, some companies have been doing that for several years now. It's a question of getting back to the risk management piece of you measure the temperature of the shipments because you want to manage the risk better. I accept the questioner's comment about ESG concerns, but in many cases, and I think we've all seen this, while sustainability and so on is a nice buzzword, in many cases, it's just good business sense. It's avoiding waste, it's managing your risks better, it's making sure that your logistics is efficient. Sure, you need to take a good hard look at the bigger picture, that's clear, but I see no reason why that should give us additional costs in the long run.
Right, and what about this idea that more people companies are applying cold chain supply chain to goods that previously didn't need it, like room temperature goods? Have you seen that, maybe that generally in the industry? I'm not sure I have.
I think it's a general trend, certainly in Europe, this side of the pond, as it were. I think the US has been, with its being a homogeneous market and with its transportation networks, has probably had less requirement or less drive to do so. But nevertheless, I think it's coming. I would also say that in certain particular industries, one of the key things would be, for example, if you're dealing with high value drugs, you're clearly going to do all you can to monitor aspects of that shipment, no matter what temperature it is, because you want to keep it within temperature and for it to arrive safely, undamaged, all of the other things that we've mentioned.
Right, thank you. But it sounds like if there's a greater proportion of goods basically going through the cold chain, that everybody should be listening to this webinar and learning from the pharmaceutical industry. Excellent. Thank you. I have another question for Richie. This is a little technical. Tive loggers cannot be submerged into dry ice below 80 degrees, minus 80 degrees C. Currently, are Tive working on any innovations for frozen goods at minus 80?
Yeah, so they're already here. So we have probes.
Great.
Only one. So for cryogenic, there's a cryogenic probe, there's a dry ice probe. They come with a logger. And the benefit there is that with the logger and the probe combination is you get the temperature from inside. What's going on inside the dry ice environment is that in the right temperature, and you also get the temperature on the outside of the package. And again, the aggregated data there can be helpful to understand what are the limitations of that packaging, what's happening on the outside that causes some sort of change or shift on the inside. And then can you maintain and have real-time visibility to the temperature of both inside the package as well as outside the package, combined with light, combined with shock and location and all this other really rich data, so that, you start looking at all these things together, it kind of tells the story of what's happening with the specific shipment.
Wow, that's great. And that wasn't a planted question, by the way. So let's just, we're beginning to run out of time here, but I'm curious about what the barriers are to implementing real-time shipment tracking. Is it expensive? Is it difficult? Is there too much data that you don't know what to do with? Richie, you tell us first. What are the barriers?
I think the biggest barrier is likely change management, right? It's just, there are a lot of systems and processes and SOPs in place to support passive devices, from placing them to pulling them off of shipments, to ensure the baseline that no bad therapies or drugs go to a patient, right? Like that is the number one. We can't sacrifice that. So I think like that is maintaining that baseline is probably perceived as one of the bigger barriers. And so I think Tive and real-time technology should be viewed as an additive or something that can be presented where you don't disrupt that flow, or you don't change, you kind of lessen the change management, lessen the impact. Certainly cost is something that can be perceived as a barrier as well. But, like Chris was mentioning, you may increase cost here in your technology, while your cost on labor and reshipments and, check calls and all these other things where you are having a lot of those costs are going to go down. So you may raise costs one area in order to reduce bigger costs in other areas. And so I think that should be seen, like that's your basic ROI for why you would adapt new technology. But those are some of the barriers that may be perceived, but I feel like those are easy to work through, or at least that there's a clear path to work through both of them.
Right.
Yeah,
and it's crucial to have this understanding that you're not going to risk that priority of making sure that nobody gets bad therapy, but that you can also bring in all sorts of other things into the mix with this new technology. It sounds like. Chris, what do you think the barriers to adoption are?
I think that a lot of it is around change management. I think it always used to strike me as being rather bizarre that you would have in this industry multi-million-dollar shipments being made with a $20 device, and that was dependent upon the shipment going correctly and then showing that the temperature was fine. We moved on from that, and I think, as Richie said, the devices that are now available de-risk that, and as a result of that de-risking, reduce our costs. It's as simple as that. And I think it's very, very important always to have that bigger picture and understand that. But that's the future, and the future is with us now. There's no question that we should be moving towards these integrated systems, which at the heart have got real-time monitoring devices.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I'd like to ask one final question. if to both of you, starting with Richie, if pharmaceutical supply chain executives knew a few years ago what they know today, what would they do differently?
Yeah, I think that the big takeaway would be that executives would understand that when you look at patients getting their medications on time and in full, when you look at the financial implications, and when you look at sustainability, that these things are not mutually exclusive, that technology can support all of these initiatives, and what leads to better results from a sustainability standpoint, what leads to more and more patients getting their therapies and treatments in time may also lead to a better bottom line and better financial outcomes. And so these things don't have to be separate, and technology can support them all.
Fantastic. That's very succinct, Richie. Chris, what do you say? What would they do differently if they knew what they knew today?
Well, I think, as we know, the last 2-3 years have been a bit of a roller coaster for the industry. I think within that, there's been a lot of self-congratulations because the industry has proven its supply chain to be resilient. But to say it's not been easy would be an understatement, and plenty of it has been, frankly, seat of the pants stuff. So I think building that flexibility into supply chains has become absolutely critical. And a lot of that work is ongoing, of course, but I think some of that had been done pre-pandemic, which it should have been. I think we'd have been in a lot better position to handle.
Oh, losing you there. I think you made a great point. Thank you, Chris. I'm afraid we've run out the clock. Thank you so much to Richie from Tive and Chris from Supply Chain Operations. And thanks to all of you in the audience for participating. It would be pretty weird if we were all here without you. So thank you for attending. I think we've learned a lot about how technology can drive resilience and sustainability in the pharmaceutical supply chain, hand in hand. If your question during Q&A session wasn't answered, or if you have follow-up questions, please do feel free to contact Richie or Chris at the email addresses you see on your screen now. We will also be sending you a copy of this webinar, which will include this information. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe, stay happy, and enjoy the rest of your day.